Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening on our finale webinar on being human conversations. Today, we will be talking about men's mental health and empowering men through open dialogue. We have two extraordinary guests who will be joining us today, who I will introduce shortly. But I just want to say thank you for being here once again. This is our last session for the year, the last On Being Human webinar for the year. We've had great success over this year, and it's truly because of your engagement and your involvement in the process. So I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to today's webinar, which I think is a really important conversation that we will be having. Maybe some of you would have known this, that on the 19th of November, it was International Men's Day. And I think that today's conversation is really apt and important to have during this time. So we're joined by two guests. The first guest is Craig Wilkinson, who will be speaking to us about fatherhood, about masculinity, fatherlessness, and all things that are related to the wellness of men. Craig is an award-winning social entrepreneur. He's an author, and he's also a dad coach. And Craig is absolutely passionate about empowering men and training young boys in really being the best versions of themselves. So I really look forward to hearing about the work that he's doing, and he's done quite extraordinary work in South Africa, but I think also regionally as well. He's doing some work there, so I'm really excited to hear and learn a lot more about the work that he's doing. And our second guest for today is Nokulunga Mokgele, who will be joining us this evening. Nokulunga is a senior psychologist in state, and she currently works in private practice and in state. Her area of interest is paternal mental health, especially around fathers and working with fathers who have distressed children. She works in the inpatient unit, where she works with adolescent boys as well as men in inpatient settings. So she has a wealth of experience, a wealth of clinical experience that she's going to be sharing with us today concerning some of the themes that she sees in her work, both in private practice as well as in state. So I hope that you have your teas, your coffees, and your waters, and you're ready to engage in today's webinar. And I ask you that please prepare questions, and just towards the end of our webinar, we will have an opportunity for you to ask your questions. So perhaps let's get into it. And I understand that Craig is still struggling with network on the road. He was traveling from Botswana on one of his missions to impact men in the work that he does. So he will join us while we are on the webinar, but we do have Lunga, who is about to appear on the screen now. So let's introduce you, Lunga. Good evening, Lunga. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Matetsi. Thank you for having me yet again this year. It's actually a
Yes,
pleasure.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So this is for the audience's knowledge. This is my second webinar with Lunga. We had our first webinar in
Mm,
June this year, and we felt that, there was so much to unpack. There was so much meat that we really didn't get into.
mm,
And we decided that we needed a follow-up webinar. But we also thought that it would be important to have a male voice
mm,
in the room, because the
mm.
first webinar was the two of us. But today we will be joined by Craig at some point. But let's get into it, Lunga. Perhaps let's start by you just introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about the work that you do, especially in relation to men.
Well, as I said, thank you for the intro and my bio. that I do work in a state hospital, but also I do private work. Where I've recently also had the opportunity to be part of a team that opened an adolescent unit in the south of Johannesburg, where we can now admit teens and also male teens, in that ward. So there is something moving forward, an acknowledgement that we need to create more spaces, healthy spaces for men to come to, and young men and even adolescents, um, to process their emotions in spaces that are healthy, that are containing, that are not prisons or scary reformatories, where they can access their emotions and being held by the multidisciplinary team, and be heard and seen, and I do look forward to Craig's input as well, being a mentor to dads as well. Like I said last time, it's always nice to hear what men have to say about their own issues and not women always being the ones spearheading it. And I find that in the spaces I work, the adolescents and the men, they want to be in charge of their emotions. They want to express their emotions. I recently dealt with a couple that did lose a baby, and as per usual, like I said last time, the mom will be then getting all the attention, the admission, and I had to actively hold the dad in mind and bring him in the room. And I think he was also surprised that, people are also holding his thoughts, his emotions about losing the baby and what it means for him. And that he didn't have to struggle alone on the side and just being there and supporting mom, but also that his emotions did matter as well, because he was also part of the process of the whole birthing process, and the trauma of losing the baby. Yeah.
Sure. Lunga, I remember that at our last webinar, you shared a really scary statistic around
Mm,
the bed capacities in
mm.
public hospitals that are available for men. Won't you just refresh that statistic for the audience, just to give them context about really why this conversation is important and why we need to have this conversation and pay attention to the mental well-being of men.
Well, I think the accurate numbers are not too high, but it's high. But the problem is that, but it's like when you are trying to find a bed for a male, whether it's in a state or even a private hospital, there aren't enough beds for them. They're quite limited. For instance, in some units, they'll have in private, they may have a 20-bed setting, but maybe 4 beds set aside for men. And that's worrying. That's getting a male bed and the capacity of that. And I think, but I must give it to the different hospitals that I think there's now a consciousness about that you need to put in more men in wards if they need to, because they do come. It's not that people are not reaching out. They do ask. I mean, in the last few months, I've admitted quite a few male patients, or people have come through having seen these webinars or heard about clinicians seeking clinicians that do work particularly with men issues. I think people are now becoming more active, finding people that can, but the stats is still shocking that the beds are not enough um, for men to be admitted, and to continue reiterating that and requesting that more beds must be made available for men, particularly in private, facilities. Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad to hear that there is a movement in that space, because
Mm,
if we sort of do an anecdotal ratio, what you're sharing today is that
mm,
one is to four, right? One
mm,
bed is to four for female
mm,
beds, when
mm,
actually men do need the support and the treatment. But Lunga,
Mhm.
just perhaps, let's sort of contextualize our conversation. I was reading a research report the other day. This is the
Mm,
first research, the first South African national gender-based violence research that was conducted in 2022, and I think they recently published it. And
okay.
what they say there is that one of the factors that lead to men perpetrating violence against women is that men experience childhood trauma. And they found
Mm,
that in their research, the men that were there, that are men that scored highly on, the childhood trauma index. So I
mm.
just want you to perhaps tell us a little bit more around these types of traumas that boys and men experience that are often not spoken about.
Yeah. And I think it's really sad because then half the time we only find out about the childhood traumas when there's tragedy for them. That child neglect, being told that they need to man up, or when there's an absent father, then they have to kind of be the man of the house unconsciously, um, or witnessing their moms, or being battered by their dads, and at times they end up intervening and getting injured. That rage that they harbor, and don't know what to do with it or who to tell, or then as they get older and stronger, they can't be pushed around anymore by the abusive partners of the parents or stepdads, and that happen to be in the space. And then the children want to protect maybe their mothers, but some of them they are angry that their moms brought in these unstable people in their lives, and now they have to deal with it and get abused in the process and not be protected. Then, as adults, they come across as enraging against the females in their environment, but also feeling helpless and hopeless and not knowing and paralyzed and not knowing what to do, who to share the emotions with. Because if you do share the emotions, you're either called weak, or you're not man enough or not manly enough. And I think we've spoken about that. But if you tap into the childhood trauma and you start the healing process to that, they do come around in a therapeutic process that they can stay longer. But at the same time, you also need to be mindful that sometimes they may prefer to open up to other male therapists. But I had a conversation with a male therapist, another colleague of ours, who said, but sometimes men don't open up to male therapists, sometimes they prefer women. So you need to meet the patient where they at, especially when they are traumatized, and bringing them the most vulnerable selves, especially when you go to their childhood spaces. You need to be very mindful and tactful when you engage with that. Yeah.
I mean, you speak about childhood neglect, and I find that this is often an area that's overlooked. People
Mm,
sort of don't really understand what childhood neglect is and the
mm,
impact of childhood neglect. It's
mm,
often, brushed aside, and it's not seen as something that could contribute to mental health difficulties. So, can you
mm.
give us examples of what childhood neglect would look like in little boys and young men?
So the basic explanation of child neglect is anything and everything that defies the Children's Rights Act. Not providing shelter, health, safety, and that consistency of caregivers and supervision. So though that is like a general term, and unfortunately people don't get arrested for that because we are not in the first world for that. But once children are exposed, are lacking any of those things or all of those things, it's considered to be child neglect, where there's no supervision, no one overseeing the children go to school. Legally, children need to be in school till the age of 14, by the way. But if you're over 14 and stop going, then it becomes another. legal issue, but legally 40, up to 14 years. So children under 14 years, if they don't attend school, then they found loitering, then they become vulnerable to all sorts of abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical abuse. They then can be exposed to human trafficking and drugs, and because then that's when the drug dealers and everybody get access to them and start grooming the kids, because then they can fit into gangs and belong and feel like they are being loved because of child neglect, where there's no care, there's no consistency, there's no structure that they live in. And those sort of things make our boys, and all kids, but mostly our boys, more vulnerable because now they need to scavenge and survive in a very vicious world because there's no support, there's no structure, there's no supervision, you know. And that is another form. That's how child neglect manifests. Then you get angry, aggressive children, and some people, if they're lucky and get good mentorship and get school teachers or community leaders that are caring, they will tell you that this was their lives, but now they've turned it around to become more present and available parents and have more supervision and structure. But the extreme form of child neglect leads to your conduct disorders, and disruptive disorders. So that's even more worrying. Yeah.
And it's often said that the way that men express or present, in clinical settings, if they're suffering from a condition like depression or anxiety, is very different
Mm.
from how a woman or a young girl would present. Can you
Mm.
tell us a little bit more around these sort of ways in which men present that we may not always be able to notice?
I think, I think we touched on it, and I think the person, it varies from human to human, but more so in men. But what I've been seeing is that you'll find where people will present with a lot of substance use. That's the most common one. They'll be either using alcohol or drugs, and obviously graduate to hard drugs just to self-medicate, right? To try and keep going. That's how you'd see sleep deprivation, and then typical neurovegetative features will present, like your poor sleep, lack of sleep, insomnia is very high with them that I've seen, in my experience that I've seen. I'm not saying the others don't exist, but it's mostly insomnia. They are driven, mania, expedient uh, tendencies, and they are usually in debt that they can't explain. And there's always the what you call the machonistas, the loan sharks after them, just to keep up with the standards and trying to look like they can afford when they can't, or being breadwinners and everybody are expecting them to uphold this whole I can afford. And as you see, post COVID, there's been a change in lifestyles because of the economy not being great. But people now, men will present with being stressed with financial stress and being overstretched. They self medicate. So even when you say you're taking them to a rehab center, that rehab center needs to have a psychiatric component um, to deal with the depressive features that present, because then you get a revolving door problem, because you're just dealing with the substance use, but you're not dealing with the psychiatric presentation of depression and anxiety. And others, you find that it has a pre-morbid function. It pre-existed, right? The depression and anxiety. But because of the circumstances and the financial stresses or the relational stresses or the work stresses, work bullying, whatever, then they start self medicating. Then you just think, oh, this person is just an alcoholic or a drug user. And yet, no, these guys have been depressed for a long time. And this has been a way of medicating. And that's how they would present to us.
And
Yeah.
substance use is a big one, but I've also seen that anger is also
Huge.
a common theme
Mm,
with men that are struggling, is that they
mm,
present. or they mask the depression or the anxiety with a lot of anger and rage.
Enrage, yeah, and that's where also, if you think, if you engage with them, the more angry they are, the more vulnerable the person is, and not knowing how to regulate those emotions. And it's something that we then look into, how then they get the skills on how to show anger, and how anger is sometimes villainized, and it's a natural, instinctual, emotion, which should be experienced by anyone. However, they just don't know how to regulate it and how to channel your anger, and not just to always beat someone or hit someone, not leading to domestic violence, which you unfortunately, in our country, there's a high stats on that, where men are arrested because of domestic violence. But if you go back to where it started from, where it stands from, it's the mitigating factor that these guys have been struggling themselves to regulate their basic emotions. Things like mindfulness, they're not aware, coping skills. What is an emotion? Who to name that? What you're feeling now is rage, is anger, and this is appropriate, this is not, because it was not modeled for them. If you think about neglect, where it was not modeled for them from when they were tiny, how when an emotion is okay or an appropriate or inappropriate. If you don't have a adult to model that for you, you get dysregulated and you don't know how to express these emotions. So all these things lead to that.
I mean, you're speaking about another condition which I think is really rampant in our
Mm,
society, which is lack of positive role models, lack of
mm,
parenting, or poor parenting,
mm,
where there's really not enough psychological investment in
mm,
children. And I know
mm,
you work a lot with children. Do you want to maybe tell us a
mm.
little bit about some of that, some of the work that you do and the challenges you experience when working with parents?
Yeah, I think, I'm a parent too, but also parenting is not easy. It's the hardest job ever. And also, if you think about how everyone was raised, we're not raised the same. And it speaks to another concept for another day on attachment, right? Like, basically saying how to bond with your child from birth and how that is regulated. And you find that if that was not done before a certain age as a baby, then that's it. You are unattached, and there's a concerns about that. But also, being a present and attuned parent, it's always dependent on you and your emotions, where you at. If you are not okay, if you're financially distressed, it's really hard to be calm and mindful of what your child is experiencing, what they're feeling, and naming those emotions. However, in parental counseling, we always tell parents it's okay to feel overwhelmed and dysregulated, but you need to calm down and then only speak to your child and regulate yourself so that they model these things. Now, when you are constantly overwhelmed, depressed, overworked, angry parent, then you can't be present and attuned. And that's the challenges that we then experience, that parents need to pause and have their own space to talk about parenting, because that was never modeled for them. So it's difficult to even do it to their own kids. And now for our boy kids, they'll be told, "Kumela ngaphandle," go outside, go and play with your boys, and go to your room, in a very harsh way. I'm not saying that you mustn't set limits and boundaries. I'm not saying that, but also be mindful of your words, how they land, because you may be angry at that moment, and what you say to your son will always be, that's how moms are, that's how dads are, that's how dads relate. And just to pause, like, it's really hard to pause when you're in the middle of something, you know, and see and acknowledge where your child is at, the little milestones that they go through, because you miss them, and that's it. You've lost them. And the crucial milestones, your 7-year old, your 10-year-old boys, your 13-year-old, your 15-year-old, your 18-year-old, every one of those stages matter. And it's really important to be mindful of that, where your child is at and how you engage and hold them. I see Craig is here. Hi, Craig.
Greetings. Sorry
All
I'm so
right.
late.
No problem.
That's
Yeah.
all right. We're glad you were able to join, Craig.
Okay.
We've just been speaking a little bit about parenting
Okay.
and child neglect, and more
Right.
specifically around what that looks like for boys
Mm,
and
Right.
men. So Lunga was
mm,
Right.
just sharing from her clinical experience what that looks like. But now that we
mm,
have you, can you maybe do a little bit of an introduction and you tell us about the work that you do at Father Nation and some of the challenges that you come across when working with, whether it's with boys or with men?
Right. Thank you. Well, thanks for having me on here. I'm surrounded by beauty and brains. I can see that. um, Yeah, so I was a single dad for many, many years, and just began to realize the incredible importance of fathers. Single moms are heroes in this nation, but they're carrying a burden
mm,
that they shouldn't have to carry. And so I just realized, I became known as the pops of all my children's friends. When my son turned 18, he wrote me a letter saying, "Dear Dad, I want to thank you for being my brother, my best friend, but most of all, my father." And it was the best gift I've ever received. It was a tearjerker, and he
mm,
said, "I consider myself the most fathered human on earth," and I was just amazed at that. I have a son who's now 31, a daughter who's 28, and that led me to write books about fatherhood, which I did, and then I began to be very passionately concerned about the gender-based violence issue in our nation and the fatherlessness as well, and very
mm,
unhappy around how we were tackling the issue. We were tackling the issue by creating awareness, which is important, but you can't stop there.
mm,
You've got to find out why is this happening. If, no boy's born an abuser, no boy's born a misogynist, no boy's born a racist. These are things that happen. Something goes wrong on the journey from boy to man.
mm,
And violence, I wrote some material on positive masculinity. I call it the six pack of masculine virtues. And we found it's a non-profit organization, and the belief is that if we can heal men, we can heal the world.
yeah.
And men, schools, clubs, universities, teaching humanity, and also
Mm,
working with men and women in the fight against gender-based violence.
Thanks for
mm,
sharing, Craig. But maybe let's start with where you ended and perhaps share a synopsis or share your thoughts around your understanding of why we are facing the scourge of gender-based violence.
mm, mm, mm,
For me, there's four reasons. There's never an excuse at all. Reason number one is maternity, fatherless. Men growing under unprotected, and wounded men are more dangerous than wounded women, because they take out and so wounded masculinity that men have is I'm not man enough, and so feel this need to prove their manhood, to dominate, or they become very destructive to self. So woundedness is a big cause. Secondly, means to sort of about masculinity, which is totally false. Power, money, and big boys don't cry. Uh,
mm,
the more sexual partners, the more power you have, the more money you have. In fact, you need money and power to be a man. Again, those misconceptions. And the fourth, be tough and show emotions. So that's the second reason. The third reason is the first one. If you look at the history of our nation, it's a very broken history. It's very damaged. There were families broken up, migrant labor, and these kind of wounds don't heal overnight. They become intergenerational. I don't work brokenness in our nation. Anyway, the third one is false notions about the woman. A lot of men that a woman is the kitchen, or a woman can't lead, or false notions about the, instead of believing are equally valuable co-creators of the world, and we're partners, bringing different things but equal. As emasculating circumstances, so unemployment, and again, men and when they are unable to provide, they feel emasculated and they feel a need to prove their masculinity, and they react in bad ways. They drink, etc. So if you take those four reasons, it's a perfect storm, and South Africa has an abundance of all of those. So for me, that's a synopsis of why we.
Yeah, and I suppose it sort of ties into what Lunga you was speaking about around a fifth factor, which I believe maybe Craig you spoke to it in a different way, which is a high incidence of childhood trauma. You know, I was reading a report on the first report on the South African national research of gender-based violence, and they found that childhood trauma is also quite a key indicative of whether a man will become violent or not.
Yes. Absolutely, yes, it is.
And Craig, for you, okay. Sorry, Craig, we're losing you there.
Can you hear me? Am I audible?
We can. You're audible.
Okay. That came out that said mental health in men is a big cause of this. And I said, oh, finally they realized the trauma that leads to mental health issues. Because a psychologically damaged man is a dangerous man. And childhood trauma plays a massive role in it.
Absolutely. And so for you, Craig, just sort of maybe going back to the healthier side of things, what is a healthy masculinity for you? How would you define that, and what does that look like every day?
It's a man who uses his strength only for good. He's not passive, he's not aggressive. Whatever strength, influence, money, psychological strength, physical strength, he uses only for good. Serve, honor, protect, provide to the best of his ability. He's a man who judges himself not by his image or his externalities or money. He judges by his character. He's a man who takes full responsibility. He's a man who mentors the next generation. And fundamentally, he's a man who makes the world a better place. You know, his wife is a better woman because he's in her life. His society is better because he's in it. His children are better. You know, he's a net giver. You know, and I mean that's a definition of what masculinity is.
And what sort of advice would you then give to men who haven't had fathers or didn't have role models or mentors? How do you firstly what would you say to them if these are men who are wanting to do better in terms of how do they identify any sort of harmful behaviors that they're engaging in that they would like to do differently? What would you say to them, and how would they go about that process?
You ask the best questions, straight to the point. Look, every man needs to start by looking in the mirror, and we've got to say to ourselves, you know, is there any way in which I'm behaving which is destructive to others or destructive to myself? So any addictions, any alcohol that's too much, any ways in which my words are being harmful to anyone else, if I've got a bad temper. You know, it's very easy to say, well, look, honestly look in the mirror and do an assessment and say, am I a net good to the world, or am I destructive in any way to self or others? That's the starting point. And then it's to start on an intentional journey to say, you know what, I don't want this. I want to be a good man. I want to be a man, you know, one day when I'm gone, people will going to say that man truly made a difference. And then you start a journey, and there's so many resources available. There's so many of my mentors, men and women who I've read their books. I listen to YouTube clips. There's so much available now for us to seek out. So seek out mentors. Then seek a band of brothers. Seek men who want to go a similar journey to you, and say, "Hey, dudes, the life we live is constructive. It's not good. Can we work together to change this?" So you seek out mentors. You examine yourself, and you go on a journey. And so, as a man, how could you start this intentional journey and seek out mentors, men and women? The process begun, and they need help with. Maybe it's need help with. Maybe it's there's Lifeline. There are. The point is, you find the resources and you transform.
Sure, that's a wealth of knowledge there, and a wealth of tools that men out there who are listening can perhaps start applying. And just to put it out to our audience, we will be taking questions shortly. I'm sure you're burning to ask Craig or Lunga some questions. But Craig, just going back to you, I read one of your articles that spoke about the loneliness that men experience. Do you want to maybe tell us about that, just a little bit about that, and what causes that?
Well, again, and this is where men and women differ. Two women will meet, and within an hour they know each other, and there might even be tears, because they're able to share. Two men will meet, and 2 weeks later, all they know is, "I'm a chief supporter." We don't tend to share our hearts. So the research internationally has shown that most men are lonely, and they become more lonely as they get older. At school, at university, you've got, but men can have a lot of friends, that they can drink with and watch a game with, but that's as far as it goes. That's as deep as it goes. And you'll often find, years ago, he took his own life. And at the funeral, a bunch of us began to ask ourselves, what Pete was going through. None of us knew, because he didn't feel like he could. He felt like if he showed his vulnerability, he was being weak and less than a man. And so this is what causes us to be lonely as men. We don't go deep. We feel we have to be strong and resolute all the time. We can't be weak. We can't be vulnerable, not realizing that vulnerability is actually a strength. And so we walk through life surrounded by people, but lonely, because no one, we're scared to be vulnerable.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. Lunga, do you have maybe a question for Craig, or Craig, do you have a question for Lunga?
I'm sure I will as we go on.
As we go along, yeah. I think listening to Craig, I think I'm grateful that, as I said, but we need to hear from men as well. And Craig has actually express that, what men need and what they lack, and how they perceive each other. And I think the last comment on men can be lonely while they're in the company of friends, it's true. I mean, I grew up with a lot of male cousins, about 19 of them. And, they have thousands of friends, and friends will die, friends will be in hospital for critical things, and they'll be shocked, and yet you were with the person the day before. And it's like, how? Because they're too scared to go deeper. And he's right. Women will talk about work experience, personal experiences, challenges, and people will look at you like, but are you okay? Then you can talk. But with guys, like, no. Then they change the subject to, did you see that game? That was terrible. And then they just shift to the topic. And it's like, but you're not okay, But they can't go back to that. Even when we're talking, Craig, about an incident I had where the way men will present to me as emergencies, and the emergency might be a couple has lost a child, right, to pregnancy. Quickly, the woman will be sorted out, engaged with, and men are forgotten in that process, and they never put up their hand and say, look, I'm also not okay. And they always get shocked when I ask them, are you okay? Can I also book you off from work because you also just lost the baby, you know?
Yes.
And not acknowledge that they too sometimes they don't know how to receive that support and what to make of it because it's not generally offered in space as well. In my line of work, it's not that easy. We try, you know, and in the past few years, dads are much more present. I work in the children's clinic as well. They're much more present in their children, and they attend their sessions. They want to know. They want to engage with the dynamics that's present, and I welcome that because it shows that people are starting to be attuned to that. But also, you spoke about men not having proper models, and it's true. Most of, like, given the history of our country, and also men don't know how to be fathers, how to
Yes.
be uh, healthier men. And you only see the adverse side of things. And sometimes the adverse side of men and masculinity is glamorized, as made to be
Yep.
popular, and say to show your money, show your cars, flashy cars. But actually, that's not it. That's not what
Exactly.
masculinity is all about. It's a whole lot more. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, building on what you say, I mean, someone said a profound thing. He said the biggest lie that men tell.
Sure. Did we lose? I think
So
we lost Craig.
yeah, and that was
Such a,
crucial.
yes, yes. I'm sure he'll
Oh, he's
jump
back.
back. Yes, there
There
we
we
Yes,
go.
I'm
go.
back. Sorry.
Yes.
Sorry, it's a sick. Yeah. Yeah, the biggest lie men tell is I'm fine when they're not fine because it takes courage to say I'm not fine, you know.
Mm,
And that's we need to break that misconception that vulnerability is weakness.
mm,
Very, very, very so. But you're right. Fathers are becoming more engaged. I mean, I'm passionate about fatherhood. It's
mm,
every boy and every girl needs a mother and a father, and if it's not biological, a village of men and
yes,
women who can input into their lives. There are questions that
mm,
I can't answer for my daughter. I mean, I can't
mm,
I can't model to my daughter how to be a woman. I
mm,
can teach her pretty much everything else. And likewise, my wife cannot teach my son how to be a man. So
mm,
when we have a society where there's present and engaged mothers and fathers, men and women, that's what raises healthy boys and men. And we need to move back towards that.
mm,
That there's this sort of narrative, I suppose, in society where where I can do it all as a woman. I think that that's not a very helpful way of trying to build a family structure. And also, like you're both reflecting on, that there's a value that a man brings in a family system. There's
mm,
value in what a woman brings, and together they're these frontiers for children, because children look up to them, and there's a
mm,
healthy function of the paternal function, and there's a function for maternal
mm,
function.
mm, mm,
100%. I mean, that's
mm,
the design, isn't it? That's the perfect design. Look, the sad thing is um, because men have messed up so monumentally, there's been abuse, there's been neglect. There are a lot of women who've been very, very let down by men, and not just let down, but hurt. And I think what you were saying, the attitude of I can do it alone, sisters are doing it for themselves. It's a backlash against that, and so let's not mess around. Women can be very damaging to their kids as well. Uh, so if for instance a single mom is raising a boy and she's been either abused, God forbid, or abandoned by a man, she's justifiably angry with men. But if she grows up resenting men, angry at men, her son is going to pick that up because his mom is his world. His mom is the most important person in his life, and he's going to get from her that men are bad. and he's going to say, well, I'm becoming a man, so maybe I shouldn't become a man, so it messes him up psychologically as well.
Mm,
So we need to develop this attitude of it's not either or, it's both and. It's not woman's turn or men's turn, it's humanity's turn, which means that both men and both women are equally important and play equally important roles, and we need to acknowledge that, and as men and women celebrate each other, celebrate ourselves, and promote a society in which all of our contributions are equally valued.
mm, mm.
Mm.
And so what are we missing in society? That we of course have these staggering rates. We are the rape capital of the world. Gender-based violence, femicide. These statistics are scary. But what part of the truth is that these men don't exist in a vacuum. We raise these men. They're in our houses, they're in our homes. We live with
Yeah.
these men. And so there's a social responsibility that we also need to take when we talk about the social ills of society that perhaps
Yeah.
are perpetrated by men. So I suppose my question to the both of you is, what are we missing as a society? And what sort of gender transformative programs do we need to put in place to address these social ills and help boys and men?
I'll go second. How's that?
That's a smart move, Craig.
Ladies first.
Ladies
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 first,
first.
first.
yes, that's right. It's like, well, but Chetty, that's a very broad, thought-provoking question and a big ask, because I think I'm a very solid believer of prevention. Let's start young. Let's start with our boys very young. You know, that they can feel things, they can regulate emotions, they can be mindful, they can have mentors, and you don't necessarily have to have a dad in the house to be mentored. To find men that do, like, so organizations that Craig have, that do go to schools, that do let's find where meet the kids where they are, so that they have those experiences of learning to tie a tie, from a school person, a counselor, or somebody, a positive figure, because I think it starts there. Because if you wait for a crisis or like somebody to be incarcerated before you act, it's not helpful. Let boys go to before there used to be camps and Boy Scouts and things like that, where you could learn all these life skills in a non-threatening way. Not because now our 12-year-olds, instead of learning to tie knots and things like that, they are groomed to sell drugs and all those, and start smoking and having alcohol. Whereas we could be having these really amazing programs for them, so that they know that there is a good out there. That it's not all bad and gloomy. And our social services, our justice system, our health system, our schooling system, we all need to work together. We can't work against each other. And even our NGOs, knowing where to go. I know there's a boxing program, an amazing boxing program, which Luke Lambert runs in Johannesburg, in the inner city, where even sports, like, it's important, to be there. Because if you go to the townships, there aren't a lot of sporting activities, recreational spaces where they can have that outlet and that testosterone to just run, but in a much more constructive way,
Yeah.
and you need those things, like schools, like the sport masters at schools need to be supported and not alienated, because they are the ones who are face the frontline people that the kids have access to, you know all those things. I think if we could just have that working system. And if you need support, speak to each other, have forums where we can support. Now I know about Craig, and I'm so curious to, like, how can I bring him in to our programs, not just sit in my clinical space and say, I'll deal with it alone. You work with everyone that will nurture if we want our country to move forward. And if you say the government must do this, but you are the government. We are the advocates. We see it. Craig, Lunga, you, but it's doing this is a space of like, say, we're doing something. Let's start somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said, and I think we need to focus a lot more on raising boys to be good men. More programs for men, more programs to teach, equip, inspire, help, support fathers, and boys society-wise. And the message of late has been, and I work a lot with teenage boys and men in all settings. From taverns in townships to corporations.
Mm,
Men are feeling demonized. The whole
mm,
hashtag men are trash, the whole toxic masculinity. So men respond to not to being beaten on the head with a stick. Men respond to when we call out the champion in them. And I say to men, in your DNA, men, is a rich heritage a rich history of heroism.
mm,
Any country in the world, any village, any place in the world, you don't have to go far back to find men who were heroes. Who worked hard for their families, who fought for their families, and that's in the DNA, men. And if we start to give the message that masculinity, true masculinity, is a beautiful gift to humanity, um, and start encouraging and inspiring boys, bringing it into the LO programs at school, having programs. And I love what you were saying, Lunga, it's about, Cub Scouts is beautiful. It doesn't have to be the biological father in the house. It can be an uncle, a grandfather. It can be a camp, a program, a male school teacher, a coach. These we need to really motivate and inspire and network these mentors that can mentor young boys and inspire them, because only by doing that will we raise healthy men. You tell a man he's trash, I promise you he's going to behave trashy. It's not going to fix
mm,
him. Um, the thing that men crave most from women is not what you think it is. It's respect. Men
mm,
crave respect, and when obviously if they don't deserve it, they don't get it. But if a man is given respect, it fuels his self-esteem and helps him to become a better man. If he doesn't get that, he often responds in a very bad way. So, as a society, as a government, with our messaging, our media, we need to say, men, man, we appreciate you. You're a gift, and here's how you behave. You can be a blessing or a curse. The choice is yours, but let's help you be a blessing.
mm, mm,
Sure. Such powerful insights. And it just sort of makes me think about, what you mentioned, Craig, how harmful and unhelpful these sort of narratives that there's, toxic masculinity and men are trash, hashtag men are trash, how, unconstructive it is and actually quite divisive in our society. I mean, I can understand the rage and anger that we
Sure.
do feel let down by men. We do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I think that we are in a space where we need to work towards each other. Walk and let's it's a journey together in this process to make a difference.
Yes.
mm.
Absolutely.
All
Yeah.
right. So
Men and
maybe
women are.
yes. Go
No,
ahead,
carry on,
Craig.
Karen.
No,
I was
I
just
was
going to
just
say
going
we
to
are
say we're going to take a question. We'll take a question
Okay.
just
Cool.
after
Cool.
you speak.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
We're co-creators, men and women. If you think about it, um, you and I exist today because a man got together with a woman and they co-created us. And so the whole world is designed to be, in society, for men and women to bring their pieces to co-create as equal partners. I mean, that's how the world works. And if we're at war, it doesn't work.
Yeah. And it doesn't help the most vulnerable people in society, which
No,
is children, isn't
Mm,
it? And that should
exactly.
mm,
always be our priority, is how do
mm,
we
Absolutely.
create a society that's safe for children? But we do have a question here. Well, it starts with a comment, I suppose. Thank you for this conversation, but let's see. This is deep. Is it the masculine part of us, men, that stops us from expressing ourselves and being closed off, or is there more to it? like society and stigma? I suppose
Well, I
anyone
mean,
can
it's a
take
great
that
question.
question.
Look, masculinity is often misconstrued, and so the media and the
Mm,
stigma attached to it is wrong, because masculinity is both. I always teach men that there are two sides to you as a man. There's the warrior, and there's the lover, and both are
mm,
crucial. The warrior is the part that steps up, stands up, takes responsibility, and at times you don't cry because the world needs you, someone needs you, you need to be strong. I mean, there is that part of masculinity, but that's only half of it. The other side is the nurturing side, the lover side, the caring, that can be vulnerable, that can be emotional, that's emotionally literate. You see, a lot of men are emotionally illiterate. They haven't been taught how
mm,
to understand and express their emotions.
mm,
And so the mistake we make when we're angry with men is we try to feminize men. So we
mm,
ask them to give up the warrior, stop being the warrior, and just be the lover. And that's not good
mm,
either, because that can lead to passivity. The other
mm,
side of it is men become very macho, and so they don't have the feminine side, the nurture side. They just are the warrior. So true masculinity is both a warrior and a poet, a warrior and a lover, and that's what we need to teach and inspire. And
mm.
society hasn't done that.
And I also like to say that that question is quite a loaded question, because also how you were raised is how emotions were modeled is how you will then regulate and show emotion. And it's not necessarily about how strong you are, how caring you are, but it's also how your environment impacted you, and then ultimately society will say don't express emotion, you men don't die kindly, men don't cry, and all of those things. Then they start adding to you not showing your emotions like you should, and when you do show them, you show them in an inappropriate, adverse way, and that's when we'll end up with domestic violence and things. What was modeled for you? So there's a lot of variables that can impact your presentation when you're not holding or not disclosing your emotions.
Very much so.
Sure. Thank you so much. I mean, there's so much insights that have come out of the session. We could go on and on and on, but I'm afraid we are at time, and we're going to have
So
to leave it there for today. We can't take any more questions, but I trust that this is the beginning of many more webinars and conversations, and really working towards making a difference and an impact in our society. So I want to thank you, Craig, for joining us today. I know you were traveling, doing some regional work in Botswana.
Yes,
So thank you for making the time and actually and
pleasure.
joining our call. And also happy belated International Men's Day. I think that was on
Thank you, thank you.
Tuesday, the 19th.
Indeed, the 19th. Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. And thank you, Lunga. Lunga is a great colleague of mine, trusted colleague of mine. We see the work that you're doing for fathers and for adolescent boys and for men. So feel very grateful for all that you do. So we are going to have to leave it here, but we will share your contact details with the audience. So if there's anyone who would like to get in touch with Craig, we will send a follow-up email with all your details, Craig, as well as Lunga's details, and they will get in touch with you. All right.
Thank you to
thank
both of you.
you.
Lovely sharing the platform, and appreciate your insights and your hearts and what you're doing. And let's keep doing it and make it happen.
Indeed.
Absolutely. All
It's
right.
also a
Bye-bye,
pleasure as
everyone.
well. Bye.
Okay,
Thanks for
then.
having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.